11:10, 11:15, and we will just go straight out, refill our coffees, grab our donuts, and go right to our breakout class. The one that meets in here will get going. The one that meets in there will get going. Boom, boom. And we'll come back in here around 12:05. So not really out of the ordinary, okay? It's not going to be like a whole long day because we have a business meeting, because we'll just make breakouts streamlined and a little bit shorter, but not because we won't have them or because we don't care, but just because we'll get right to them. So that's the first announcement, business meeting, and, don't be thinking about that too much. Get in the business meeting mode after the service. Today, we're going to do a little theologizing. Second announcement, though, is that yesterday was the first time that we partnered with The Well to do the kinship program, and it was awesome. A few of us, like 6 of us, went out and to an area off of like Fletcher, Fletcher and 12th, kind of that area, and we set up 2 tables with a bunch of food donated from like Whole Foods and Abby's and a couple places, and literally just had free groceries. Like, that's basically it, right? It's in this area where there's lots of people who like walk, lots of walking, lots of biking, so tons of traffic, and we had 2 like 6-foot tables full of food, and it was gone in about an hour, so it was really cool. And just a good time to meet people you wouldn't normally have met, and to just be, I can't think of a word outside of like my churchy background. I'm about to say be a blessing, and like it is a blessing, but just be like a real like positive influence in someone's life. Blessing tends to be not tangible, but like a blessing, a true blessing, right? I was thinking of like, man, if I got a week's worth of groceries, that would extend my budget like a good bit, And so now take someone whose budget is probably even way more strapped than mine, and it's just like a huge thing to be able to get like that week's worth of groceries. We had eggs, milk, food, all this stuff. So it's really cool. We're going to be doing that the 4th Saturday of every month. If you like to come out, if it's something you think you'd be interested in doing, 4th Saturday every month, mark your calendars. Come if you can. It's a good time. Something we need for that, though, is bags, plastic bags, right? So keep all your grocery bags. Keep them. We do this once a month, like as this church, but they do it 3 other times. They do it every week, The Well does, with different groups. So we need grocery bags, is something I was told. So when you go shopping, save them, bring them here to this building, and we will get them used. It'll be good. Okay, into the sermon. Like I said, we're going to do a little theologizing, right? Building up a little theology for our church. It's going to be cool. Because, I realized the past week through several events that I think what we talked about last week needs to be unpacked even more. Last week was this vision for who we want to be as a church, and really, my point was it's a vision for churches in general. Like, a church is this group of people who gather together to be the seed planted for this new kingdom of God world, right? That egalitarian society I talked about. And we only reach that through transformation, right? Gracious transformation. Transformation of ourselves based on this idea of acceptance. We talked about that last week. But I think that's the base, that's like the good news. There's so much more inside of that, obviously, right? Evidenced by all the writings of the New Testament. Like, people caught wind of this vision and joined in. Remember in Acts, 3,000 people in one day were like, yes, we want to be a part of this world. And they came and they joined the church. Well, then there's all kinds of ins and outs and things you can do to be more effective, and ways to be transformed, and ways to look inside yourself and be like, whoops, that's dark. That's something that I might need to address, right? So there's all kinds of like areas of life that are affected by this new vision of a new world, the kingdom of God. And that's why there's so many writings about it. And unfortunately, I think over the years, some of these writings have like been given a lot of baggage, and so we're going to try to not take the baggage away, but give it new baggage, right? Answer the questions for ourselves and for our time. And we're going to start from ground zero. So last week was this vision, this radical vision. We're going to go back today, and we're going to talk about why is transformation even needed? Right? Is that a question you ask yourself? Like, we say that the only way we can reach this kingdom of God is through transformation. Why aren't we all just born like in the kingdom of God? Why aren't we all just naturally like self-actualized, or whatever word you want to use, right? Like, why aren't we all just naturally secure within ourselves and loving to our neighbors and gracious and merciful, like all these things that we value? How come that's not the way everything is already. Why do we need transformation at all? There's an idea in the New Testament, and well, the whole Bible really, right? There's this word that is called sin. And it's kind of a word that has a lot of baggage to it. We're going to talk about that word today. Today's sermon is called A Brief History of Sin. That's what it's going to be, and it's going to be a brief history, okay? Because we have thousands, at least, what are the earliest writings that we have available to us? Like 15,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago? At least 10,000 years of human philosophy trying to answer the question, why aren't things the way they should be? And we all agree with that, don't we? That things aren't the way they should be. As I was preparing for this sermon, I looked at Buddhist thought, Hindu thought, Jewish thought, secular atheistic thought, right? Christianity, obviously. Did I say Judaism? Yeah, I did. Ancient Greek philosophy. And everybody agrees that things aren't the way they should be. How they achieve the way they should be is different. The reasons why are different. You know, like all of the way it plays out are very different from one another. But at the root, every single person agrees like, hey, things aren't the way they should be, either in the world or within myself. We all have a sense of that. The Bible talks about this idea, and it uses this word sin. Look at this verse. This is like a pretty common verse, I think. You may have heard it if you were in religious traditions that were really... I'm getting the wave, and it's not connected. Okay, here we go. Present on another screen. Projector cast. All right. Boom! Look at this verse. It's a super common verse. If you were raised in a tradition that was evangelical, right, that like really sought to proselytize, then maybe this was part of the Romans road for you. I don't know if you've ever heard that term. I was raised with it very heavily. There is no distinction between Jewish and Gentile. All sinned and fell short of God's glory. All are justified freely by His grace through the redemption that came by Jesus, Christ Jesus. It's Romans 3:23 and 24. All sinned and fell short of God's glory. You heard that phrase, right? Of course you have. Of course you have. What's going on in here? If you really like look at this verse, it's kind of there's a bunch of words that aren't commonly used in your English language, right? Like your day-to-day. When's the last time you said maybe redemption, okay? We have this idea of like coming back from something, you know, movies talk about redemption. But justified, we probably don't use a whole lot. Glory, you probably don't use a whole lot, unless it's talking about like, I got the glory, you know, like Kanye West or something. He uses the word glory a lot. Sinned is something you probably hear in culture. But what really is it, right? What is sin? What does this word mean? What is it speaking towards? And what baggage have we potentially added to it that needs to be stripped away? Those are all questions we're going to address today. First, I want to talk a little bit about this word sin, okay? So there's two main words in the Old and the New Testament that we translate with the English word sin. The first is chata, to go off course or to move from the path. That's like the main Hebrew word for this, that the English word sin represents. Chata. It's the idea of like you're walking down the path, and it's a good path, right? It's safe, it's secure, whatever, and like you veer off course, and then there's dangers along the way. The Greek word that we see behind the English word we translate sin is hamartia, to miss the mark, to make an error, okay? This is like a throwing a spear term, an archery term, javelin. Like if you're shooting an arrow, if you hit the bullseye, that's perfect, you're on target. If you hit anywhere else on the target, or, you know, God forbid, like off the target completely, then that's hamartia, to miss the mark, to make an error. And the Bible makes this point that, like, everyone has, in some sense, missed this mark, made errors, right? Gone off course. You remember the prophet Isaiah says, we're like sheep, we've all gone astray. We've all, like, left the path that we should be on. The Old Testament is full of this imagery of paths. There's two paths, the way of the righteous, the way of the wicked, right? Psalm 1, that's the whole thing. The whole entire book of Proverbs is that. These two paths. You can walk a good path, you can walk a bad path. If you walk down the bad path, that's the word chata, and that is the word that English has decided to use the word sin for, okay? Even this word sin. When you hear the word sin, do you think going off the path or making an error? Or do you think something more than that? I think something more than that, personally. And part of the reason is that there's a lot of baggage in this word from its etymology, its source, right? So this word sin comes from a Latin word, son, which means guilty. Okay, so now we have these words where Paul says, like, everyone has missed the mark, everyone's, like, missed God's glorious life, or the Hebrew way of saying, like, everyone has gone off course, everyone's followed, like, the wrong path. But now we have this legal kind of term built into it just because that was the Latin choice for the Greek word, right? Guilty. Now you're guilty. Now that's like a legal sense, like you owe somebody something else. But it's not even necessarily built into these main words. The idea of legal guilt isn't necessarily associated with hamartia or chata, okay? So bear that in mind. Now, we're starting from the place where we recognize that we all can recognize the Bible makes the point. Everybody has gone off course in some way. Everybody has missed the mark, okay? And I think that intuitively we know that, don't we? We all have said to ourselves, why did I do that? Right? Or why did that person do that to me? That clearly was not the way that should have gone. That was clearly off the mark or off the right path. It's easy to agree with the Bible's vision that everyone's gone off course. But here's the thing, the Bible doesn't necessarily answer why that is. And so many people have looked at these stories of the Bible, Adam and Eve, or these big writings of Paul where he says everyone has sinned, and they try to answer, well, why? Why is that the case? Have you ever asked that, like, why is that the case? So here's where our brief history of sin starts, because way back in the day, right, earliest human writings we have, ancient Near Eastern thought, Babylon, Sumer, all those places, okay? They kind of took this view that things go bad in the world when we as humans act in the wrong way. But their whole system is built on chaos and order. We've talked about this many times here. But the idea is that the gods in the heavenly realms set order in the universe and push back the forces of chaos and set up a stratified society to keep that in place, right? So you got kings who serve the gods, usually associated with priests. There's a ruling class. There's farmers. There's tenant farmers. And at the very bottom, there's slaves. That is order, right? That is not chaos. That's good. That's to be desired. And so if you stay in your place and you stay in your lane, right, and if you're a slave, you don't try to get up and be a king. If you're a tenant farmer, you probably aren't going to be able to ever buy real land and be a real farmer. You stay where you are. You do your task in the world that the gods appointed for you, and chaos will stay at bay. That's essentially like the view of sin or why things go wrong in the world or why people act poorly, because they're not staying within the realm of order. Okay? Now, the reason I even bring that up is because out of that thought flows Judaism, which is part of our tradition, of course, the Old Testament. And what Judaism does is it keeps this idea of order and chaos, but it doesn't say that it's built on a stratified society. It says that we all partake in order and chaos by following the right way of life, right? And so you have these things like don't eat certain kinds of fish or animals. Why? Because everything's categorized, and if you follow the right categories, you'll have order instead of chaos. So it's not categories of people anymore. In fact, right, the prophetic tradition of the Old Testament says you don't need a king, right? In the later tradition says you don't even need a priest. Like, this is all just a sham. They're just trying to take your money and all this stuff. They're not the ones keeping order. You, individuals, can keep order. How? By loving mercy, by walking humbly, right? By seeking justice. It's on each person to internalize the right way. So this is the first time now that we see this individual sense of walking the right path. And the right path in Judaism is justice and mercy and peace, walking humbly before Yahweh. Well, out of that tradition, of course, but nobody does that, right? And that's recognized in the Old Testament. Some of the prophets even say, we just need something inside of us to happen. Like, it's not, if we just keep trying to do the right thing, it just never works out. We need God's message in our very hearts, or we need new hearts, right? So the prophet Jeremiah says, I'll take out your heart of stone, I'll give you a heart of flesh. In other words, a new life from within yourself. So they recognize that transformation is needed, but again, there's no answer why this is the case. Why can't we seem to get these hearts of stone beating, right? It's just not an answer, it's just not a question that they ask, at least on a large scale. Then you go into Jesus and the early Christians. They flow out of that tradition, right? Jesus fits squarely in the prophetic tradition of like, the kingdom of God, he says, is within you, okay? Each individual person has access to this kingdom, and it is within you to bring it out and push it out into the world. And Paul, of course, and the rest of the apostles expand on that. And in that we see, again, that each of us needs transformation. That to seek this kingdom is something that is an action, right? Jesus said, seek it. Go find it. It's something you do. It's got an active sense to it. Concurrently with Judaism and in between Judaism and Jesus, there was a movement that actually started to ask, why do we do things we don't want to do? Right? Why is the world the way it shouldn't be? Why are human beings seemingly like always striving against their own selves? And this was the ancient Greek philosophers, specifically Plato. And Plato had this idea that, and I hope this is, stick with me. I hope I'm not boring you guys. It's very important because all of this goes into why we believe what we believe today and how to think about how we believe it. Plato said that everything around us, okay, is just a shadow of the actual true forms of those things that are in the heavenly realms, okay? So like, kind of a bad, cheesy example. It's not exactly how it works, but this table, right, is not a table. It's an image of a table. It's the idea of a table. In the heavenly realms, there would be an actual form of a table. Table in its pure table-y essence, right? Table-ness. And this thing exhibits tableness to some degree, but it's a shadow, it's an image. It's not exactly the essence of it, right? So, and he taught that the human condition is such that we're a body with a soul put into a body, and that soul is immortal. It existed before the body, and it'll exist after the body. And he taught that the soul, in order to escape its bodiness and be more than it can be, needs to recognize the beauty of the forms, right? To know truth in its purest form, and not with all the illusion of the world around us. And so either the soul forgot its forms, it forgot what it used to look like when it was in the heavenly realms, or maybe it needs to learn it afresh and anew through contemplation. Whatever it is, the goal of the soul is to move past the body and back into the eternal realm of the forms. Now what this means is, I don't know if Plato necessarily would have believed this, but what happens that flows out of this is like this really harsh dualism, where the soul is good and perfect and beautiful and immortal, and the body is like, well, something just holds the soul back from the forms, right? It's illusory. It's not even the true essence of life. Put a pin in that. Now we move into early Christianity that recognizes the fact that things aren't the way they should be. It's transformation within us that's needed to get them to where they need to be. And this transformation takes place in the realm of the community of people of God called the church. Any hail that the early church used to be like God was really a call back to the prophetic tradition, right? When Paul demands that his people like walk the right path and seek righteousness and try to emulate the life of Christ, he's calling people back to the very basic earthy things that entails: justice, peace, mercy, love, etc. The fruit of the Spirit, right? That's a good way to think about it. That's what life looks like for Paul. He doesn't have in his mind, obviously, because he's not really a Greek philosopher. He probably knows Plato, but he hasn't really like embraced that as a very like strong Jewish man. When Paul talks about like becoming like God, he's not having in mind this eternal soul going back to the forms, right? And leaving the body. He's talking about living a life of godness, peace, justice, love. But as Christianity progresses a little bit and we get further away from the very like Jewish roots of it all, we have these philosophers who are also Christian theologians, and they start studying the ancient Greeks again, specifically Plato. And there's this new movement, Platonism, right? Like, Plato's got this big resurgence in culture. People are wearing Plato t-shirts, like Plato is my homeboy. You would have seen that all over the Roman Empire. Like they have discovered those shirts. It's true. Look it up. Plato was really popular. Had this big resurgence. And one guy who taught a lot of Plato's works in a Christian context was a man named Augustine. Have you ever heard of Saint Augustine? He loved Plato. He loved Greek philosophy. And what he did is he sought to look at the Bible through that lens. Now, here's an important thing to note. Everybody does that. It was perfectly acceptable for Augustine to do that. Because we have these core things in the Bible, like everyone has missed the mark, things aren't the way they should be, we recognize that. But the big questions of why is that the case? How do we move forward from it? These are all questions we're free to ask and think about. And they are going to be historically conditioned. The way you were taught to think is the way you're going to think about the Bible. That's fine. That's what Augustine did. He did some really good work, taking his philosophical background and working through it with the text of the Bible. Now, unfortunately, that was 1,700 years ago. So we've come a long way since then in the way we think about philosophy and life. And Augustine doesn't necessarily answer all of our questions, but here's the rub. We're still stuck with a lot of what he thinks. Now here, let me talk about what Augustine thought about sin and where it comes from and why it plagues all of us, right? He taught very much like Plato that instead of forms, he talked about God, right? And all of the true essence is in God. And so, therefore, what we have here tends to just be like a shadow of that, especially the physical body. And he kind of taught that anything that flows out of our physical desires is in some level wrong or evil, okay? Because it's a passion we can't control, something that an immortal soul shouldn't have to deal with, okay? If our souls are trying to get back to God, then like hunger and sexual desire and things like that, those are base. Those aren't good for souls. Those are stupid body things. And he taught that sin is not anymore a going off of a path or a choice you make to shoot an arrow in the wrong direction. It's no longer error. He taught it has its own essence. It's an actual tangible, physical thing that's passed from generation to generation. Get this is true, through the sexual act. Augustine taught that even between a married couple, right, which traditionally in the Bible is acceptable, even between a married couple, Augustine taught that because of the passion that accompanies sex, it's inherently sinful. And therefore, any life that spawns from it has the essence of sin built into it. And from this idea, we have this doctrine called original sin. Okay, so Adam and Eve were people who missed the mark, right? We call it the fall. And then they had sex, and they had kids. And on 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 and on. And sin is passed down from them, actually physically transmitted. And this is what he taught. And so all people, Augustine taught, are born with this propensity to evil, this propensity to sin, and not just the choices we make anymore, but an actual essence, something physically that literally affects us. And this became dogma for the church. If you didn't believe that, if you didn't believe in original sin, that it was transmitted down, you were banished from the kingdom, right? Because Rome and the church were very tied up together. In fact, there were a couple bishops who thought maybe we just all keep making these decisions because we learn it when we see our parents do it. And they were like, anathema! It's passed down physically. And if you don't believe that, hit the road, Jack. This was the truth for the church, even though it's not biblical, so to speak, right? It doesn't arise organically from the Bible. Again, there's nothing wrong with theology. It's good to interact with the Bible in new ways. But when it becomes a dogma that people get banished for, we need to start asking questions. So that's kind of the progression. We see this flow. See my arrow flow here? Ancient Judaism, Jesus and the early Christians, at the same time as that Plato's here. Medieval and modern Christianity flow out of Jesus, of course, but they're also heavily affected by Plato. Do my arrows make sense? There's more coming. So now, we move in to a new era. And there was this group of, we're taking a big, 1,000-year leap here, okay? Before I do that, you may think Augustine was a long time ago. You're talking about Catholic dogma, original sin. During the Protestant Reformation, a lot of things were addressed with the Catholic Church, and the Protestants, reformers were like, we don't like this, we don't like this, we don't like this. But one thing that wasn't challenged was original sin. In fact, it was expanded. And there was one reformer in particular, John Calvin, who was a lawyer. And so he thought in legalese, right? Again, we're all historically conditioned. He was a lawyer, he thought in legalese, he loved Augustine. And so he looked at Augustine's original sin, he's like, I like that. I like that the essence is passed on. But even more than that, I think that Adam somehow stood as a representative for everybody. And so not only is sin's essence passed down, but your actual guilt is passed down, right? So very legal because he's a lawyer. He thought in terms of guilt. And he thought of God as like a judge type figure. And so he said when a baby is born, like a newborn baby, they're automatically under a guilty sentence from God. Now he used the language of Paul to do some of this stuff, but it's very stretched and very thin the way he does it. And we'll be talking about that in the coming weeks. But the point is, the reformers didn't actually undo original sin, and they actually beefed it up even more. So that's important for you, because you all are within the Reformation tradition, right? The Baptist denomination, the Presbyterian, Methodist, any non-Catholic tradition flows out of the thinking of Calvin and Luther and others. So this is the thing that churches have taught for a very long time, by and large. It's becoming less popular, but this is how, at least me and probably a lot of you, your mind tends to function naturally when it comes to sin. We take one word and we build a lot into it that isn't originally there. All right, move into our final movement. There's this new group of philosophers that comes around called the existentialists. And what they do is they seek, probably more fully than anyone else, to answer the question, why do we do the things we seem to not want to do? Why isn't the world the way it should be? Why can't I seem to be what I want to be? Even more than Plato, right? More than the Greeks, this is their number one thing. Existence, that's why they're called existentialists. What is the point of existence? What does the sheer fact that I exist even have to say to the way I move through life? And what they did is they spawned a whole new generation of theologians. And so that's why I have, out of medieval modern Christianity flows postmodern and current Christianity. You may call that emerging Christianity, the Christianity that's currently being built right now, right? And the existentialists directly affected this. Now, what's interesting about the existentialists is they also were directly affected by Jesus and the early Christians. So it's kind of a unique philosophical point because it flows out of philosophy, of course. They look to their fathers, Plato, Aristotle. They're philosophers. But at the same time, they had this resurgence of hey, let's read Paul. Right? So Hegel writes about Paul. Heidegger writes extensively about Paul. You have these theologians who read Hegel and Heidegger, like Dietrich Bonhoeffer writes extensively about Paul. There's this return to Paul, and these philosophers are interacting with his ideas. If you've ever read the works of Sigmund Freud, talks so much about the Bible and the stories of Genesis and the idea of law and sin with Paul. These are philosophers who deal with a biblical text, and so they're kind of unique in that Plato, right, he emerged concurrently with Judaism, kind of doing his own thing. But the existentialists, they're speaking into Christianity in a new way, but they're also being affected by it in the back door. So it's very unique, and I think this is why they have so much insight. We're going to talk about just one guy today. Kind of sums up what I think is important in our discussion about sin and why we can't do the things we want to do. His name was Martin Heidegger. And he was German, which is cool because he wrote and spoke in German, which is fun because they're fun words to say. And he had this word, Geworfenheit. You know how people say, oh, everything has to be said gutturally in German. It's kind of a joke. I don't think everything does. But when I always Google translate these words so I can have the right pronunciation. And when I put in Geworfenheit, like the little Google lady goes like, Geworfenheit. Like she literally like had the guttural thing. So I guess it is true. Geworfenheit. Do you like that word? Essentially it means thrownness. Okay? We all have this experience, Heidegger said, as humans, of being thrown into life, right? Like sprawling. Life's very odd, isn't it? There's this paradox here where you didn't choose to be here. Not one of you in this room chose to be on this earth. Think about that. Of all the things you can choose day to day, you had no control over being born, conceived, right? Birthed. That is completely out of the realm of your choice. And yet, almost from day one, you're expected to start making the right decisions, right? Think about this concept. On a small scale, it's absurd. Think about if someone comes up in a white van, ski mask, ties you up, throws you in a truck, kidnaps you, you're driving down the road like, I don't know what's happening, I don't know how I got in this situation, and then suddenly the van breaks down, okay? And your captors get out and they're like, oh man, I can't believe this. They look in the hood, the steam's coming out, they don't know what to do, they start pushing the van to the nearest gas station. Then they come back and they open the door and they're like, could you get out and help? Pull your weight around here, man. Like, that's absurd, isn't it? It's ridiculous. I didn't ask you. You put me here. I don't want to be here. That's like life, isn't it? You're thrown in. You have no control over so much of your life. You didn't choose your race. You didn't choose the schools you went to. You didn't choose the towns you lived in as a child, right? Like, all the things that conditioned you to be who you are were completely out of your control. And yet, we also have this odd sense as humans that we're free, that we can like affect the world around us. If I make this decision, this will happen. Every action has a reaction, right? Like, I can affect the world around me. And yet at the same time, I feel like this world doesn't care about me whatsoever. I feel like I'm important, valuable, and useful, and yet I live on this little speck of dust in this vast, cold, dark universe, right? To be human is to live in paradox. To be thrown. He has this quote. I should have written it down because it's very convoluted, but that's the point. He says, like, in this project of life, the thrower doing the throwing is being thrown. Right? And we have that sense that, like, I'm self-referential. I know I'm here. I know I make decisions about my own life, and at the same time, even those decisions seem out of my control and often meaningless. This is existentialism. That being human is inherently odd. It's inherently absurd. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It's an inescapable feeling of paradox. And what the existentialist taught is that with that comes kind of an inherent angst, you know, especially in our modern age. So this is why they're important. Go back to the ancient Near East. Things weren't as good as they are now, obviously, right? Like less food and less wealth and blah, blah, blah. Like any measure of human happiness was lower, but you knew your place in the world. You knew who you were supposed to be, right? You're born a slave. You stay a slave your whole life. You work as a slave. In the modern world, we have this dizzying sense that, you know, they tell us on Sesame Street, you can be anything you want to be. And that sounds good on the surface, doesn't it? But what do I want to be? I don't know. I don't know what I should be. Should I go to college? Should I do that? Should I eat at Taco Bell or should I eat at McDonald's, right? Even the smallest things. It's a dizzying array of seemingly absurd choices. And for the modern person, that brings angst, anxiety. Not just worry about what the next day is going to bring, but a deep sense of anxiety. Now, if you think that's a little dark, it is a little bit. There's a funny story about the theologian Soren Kierkegaard. He was kind of one of the progenitors of existentialism. There's a story that at one point a critic came up to him and said accusingly, like, you're just trying to make everyone depressed. And supposedly the story goes that Kierkegaard said, I'm not trying to make anybody depressed. I'm just trying to show everybody they already are. Right? So like that's humanity. For the existentials, it's like, look, you've got your anxieties. They're there because they're inherent to being a human. And I think this is probably the best explanation, the best beginning explanation of why things aren't the way they should be. It's not the anxiety. It's not the inherent sense of paradox that's wrong for humanity. It's when we think that's a problem, right? It's when we refuse to recognize it as inherent, that the existential said that's when bad things happen, right? Rather than just saying like, hey, here's where I am, let's make the best of it, here's where I am, there were different approaches. Some said don't do anything, Camus. Some said, like Nietzsche, go build your own meaning, right? But either way, however you approach it, you embrace it first and you kind of move on through it and you can have a happy, fulfilled life. But when you try to act like there is no paradox or that there's something missing in your life because of this sense of anxiety, and you start to build up systems and reasons to cover it up, when you act out of that, when you act out of the fear of looking it in the face, that's when what we would call biblically sin arises. That's when you make the decisions that hurt yourself, that hurt other people, and that hurt the world around you. It's when we refuse to look at the human condition as it really is. Now, we're going to dig into that from Paul's perspective, because he talks a lot about this idea, and specifically how the law functions in this setup, right? And how, for Paul, the law is one of these systems we use to tell ourselves a story that's actually false. We're not going to get into that today. We're closing up today. But I just want you to know that because it didn't end like a normal sermon, next week is going to flow right in from this one. And we're going to talk about two things. One, how this affects us and how we live this out religiously, specifically with law. And two, what Jesus does, what the work of Jesus does, specifically on the cross, to show us the right way forward. I hope that made sense for you today. I hope that was like a little good brief history of sin. And I hope that we can together move forward and build something, not necessarily new, but something fresh, something that can reinforce our vision and our mission. Because here's the thing, if you've got all these old ideas from Augustine and from Calvin and things like that, and you're coming to this church because you're trying to like run away from sin, or you're trying to, make God happy with you instead of angry with you, that's not sustainable. That's not going to last. That's not the vision that we're trying to inspire for ourselves or for the world. It's not going to lead to real transformation either. So together we can start to build up a theology for our church. Nothing crazy. Simple, meaningful, that ties into our vision and our goals and our spirit. Let's pray. Father, give us the courage to, just courage, so many levels. Let us embrace the fact that, maybe we've gone off course. Maybe we've engaged in hamartia, off error, missing the mark when it comes to how to think about why the world isn't the way it should be. We want to see real transformation, which means we want to know the real reasons why we need transformation. Give us the courage to just look at life for what it is, to see the courage of Jesus in his life, to see the courage of Jesus on the cross, to know that we can embrace life the way he did and move forward in it.